Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ludwig. I'm president of the Fordham chapter of the Federalist Society. On behalf of Dan Terrell, president of the Fordham Republicans, and Ross Pickoff, president of the Fordham Law Students United for Liberty, who are co-sponsoring the event with us, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's event entitled "When Should Government Intervene in the Financial Markets?" I'm pleased to see so many of you here today, including many guests that are not from Fordham. I just wanted to let you know that the Fordham chapter of the Federalist Society frequently holds events such as these on important topics of law and public policy, and if you'd like to be informed of future events, please sign your name on the sign up your email address on the sign-up sheet right there at the front before you leave. Federal Society for Law and Public Policy Studies is a group of conservatives and libertarians interested in the current state of legal order. It is founded on the principles that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of governmental power is essential to our Constitution, and that it is emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what it should be. The Society seeks both to promote an awareness of these principles and to further their application through its activities. There are Federal Society materials on the front table as well. Please check those out in addition to signing up for our email list. I'd like to remind you all again of the upcoming Federal Society Student Symposium, which will be at the end of February. Issue materials for that on the front table there as well. We're honored to have a distinguished panel today to discuss the question, when should government intervene in the financial markets? Professor Walter Block will take the position of never. Teaches economics at Loyola University of New Orleans' College of Business, where he holds the Harold E. Wirth Endowed Chair. Professor Block, a native of Brooklyn, earned his PhD in economics at Columbia University in 1972. He's also taught at Rutgers, Stony Brook, Baruch, and the University of Central Arkansas. He's authored some 300 articles in various journals, 24 books, and hundreds of articles in magazines and newspapers. He's a contributor to such journals as the Review of Austrian Economics, Journal of Libertarian Studies, and the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. He lectures widely on college campuses and regularly appears on TV and radio shows. And also, I'd just like to let you know, Professor Block will do 2 more events in New York today, a bit of a whirlwind Federal Society tour. If any of you want to go, 4 o'clock at NYU on the topic of rent control, which his dissertation was on, and 8 o'clock at Columbia University. Opposing him will be Professor Richard Squire, who will take the position of never say never. He's been on the Fordham Law faculty since 2006. He teaches corporations, corporate reorganization, and antitrust law here at the law school. He previously taught at Harvard College, where he won the Allen Young Award for excellence in the teaching of principles of economics. Professor Squire earned an MBA from Harvard Business School in 2001, same year in which he earned his JD, magna cum laude, from the Harvard Law School. From 2001 to 2002, he clerked for Judge Robert D. Sack in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, and from 2002 to 2005, he was an associate with Wachtell Lipton in New York City. This afternoon's debate will be moderated by Fordham Law Professor John Pfaff, who teaches law and economics, criminal law, and sentencing law and policy here at Fordham. Before coming to Fordham, he was a John M. Owen Fellow at the Northwestern University School of Law. Professor Pfaff earned his BA, JD, and PhD in economics, all from the University of Chicago, and clerked for Judge Stephen F. Williams on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. I'd like to thank the John Templeton Foundation for providing a very generous grant for this afternoon's event, which is part of the Templeton Series on Freedom, a national dialogue on law and liberty. Thanks again to all of you for coming, and again, before you leave, please sign up on the email list to be notified of future events. And thanks for coming to what I'm sure will be a very enlightening event, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Professor John Pfaff.
Microphone's not working, but it's small enough room. So I will talk as short as possible to give them as much time as possible. They'll be debating 2 issues today. One, whether or not we should have had a bailout in the financial sector, so not for GM, that bailout, but the bank bailout, and then also whether or not we should have insider trading. So they'll have 12 minutes each. Insider trading laws. I guess it's the same point. No laws, you have the trading. Have the laws, you don't have the trading. It's the same way either way. But it's kind of like saying I'm raising money for cancer. So they'll each have 12. No one else got that joke. Raising money for cancer. You're not actually raising for cancer. You're raising it to fight cancer. All right. Like I said, I should keep these short. They'll each have 12 minutes each. We'll start with Richard so that Walter can then disagree with everything he said. They'll then have 5 minutes of rebuttal, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So with that, Richard.
I don't normally speak with a mic, so if I'm too loud or too quiet, please let me know. This is a wonderful opportunity for me. It's nice to see that there are so many members of the Federal Society, the Fordham Republicans, and other groups that are here. And it's nice the Federalist Society invites me to these things. What happens, I did one of these last year, and what happens is some extremely distinguished conservative thinker is invited to speak, and it was Don Boudreaux last year and Walter Block this year. Wonderful, distinguished individual. And then somebody has got to go up there and be the sacrificial lamb, and I'm not doing this 2 years in a row, so I get to be the one that gets skewered. I talked to my students earlier, I made a joke about this, that I feel like I'm the Washington Generals, and if you don't know who they are, they're the team that has to go out every couple months and lose to the Harlem Globetrotters, and their record against the Harlem Globetrotters is 6 and 13,000, and I think those are about the odds here. The last time they won was in 1971. Afterward, children who came to see the Harlem Globetrotters cried. One of the members of the Washington Generals said it was like we had punched Santa Claus in the face. So I'm swinging for Santa Claus today. Okay, I feel like, nevertheless, very gracious. I feel like the deck is stacked in my favor. All I have to show here, and the way we framed the debates, is that sometimes it is justified for the government to intervene in the financial markets. And there are so many different instances in which the government does intervene in the financial markets that are non-controversial that I feel like I would have a relatively easy argument to make. For example, the Federal Reserve sets interest rates, short-term interest rates. This has been going on for coming up on a century in the United States and every other country that has a fiat currency. And the Federal Reserves in various countries have done it better than they used to. And there are some people who criticize this approach, but it's generally considered to be not especially controversial. So I'm going to try to make it a little harder for myself by pushing myself to defend some things that are a little bit more controversial. But I just want to establish the background here is that we live in a society where many people agree that the government does have some role in financial market regulation. Specifically, though, I want to talk about what happened starting in 2008 when the federal government intervened to bail out various financial firms and the financial sector during the kind of the financial panic of that point. Now, the most famous policy or program was the TARP program, stands for Troubled Asset Relief Program or Repurchase Program. Some people think the T is toxic, and that's originally what it's called. But they said toxic's a little too scary. We'll go with troubled, but it's the same idea. These toxic assets, these mortgage-backed securities, and so on. TARP was also used more widely to bail out firms that weren't even in the financial sector, such as the automakers, for example. And arguably Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, not really true financial sector. I'm going to put them aside. Try to defend the bailouts of the banks and also defend the bailouts of AIG specifically. Now, what's interesting about the financial sector? Why might we think that we want to talk about government intervention there versus other sectors? Well, some people think the answer is that the financial sector, and specifically banks, are subject to runs. When there is a perception that a bank is not going to be able to pay off all of its depositors because it's insolvent, all of the depositors, people like you and me with checking and savings accounts, try to get their money out. And they can do it quickly because of demand deposits. They can go in, try to take out their money, and this can cause the bank very quickly to fail. And it can be a very destructive occurrence. I don't think, though, that's actually the big difference between the financial sector and the rest of the economy. Some of you are in my Chapter 11 class. I see that you're here. So we're studying the bankruptcy of corporations generally. One of the reasons we have a bankruptcy system in the United States, and every other country does as well, and by the way, bankruptcy systems are a type of intervention in the economy by the government because we're overriding pure contract. One of the reasons we have them is that these firms also, even if they're not banks, can be subject to runs. Once there is a perception by creditors that they're insolvent, all the creditors will try to liquidate their positions as quickly as possible. We create a bankruptcy system to try to do this in a more orderly fashion. It's not as public as a bank run. Bank runs, fortunately none of us will ever see one, I think, because of the FDIC, which I'm going to talk about later. But when they used to happen, it happens then. Think about the movie It's a Wonderful Life. They're very public events. You see people kind of milling around a bank, panicking, trying to get their money out. But runs on other types of corporations similarly happen very quickly and they're very destructive. It is happening not on street corners, but through the legal system. But it's the exact same dynamic. So I don't think that runs are the reason that the financial sector is different. I think the financial sector is different because of the type of creditor, the type of investor. All of us are creditors who have checking account or savings account. We're creditors to banks, but none of us are very sophisticated creditors. What I mean by sophisticated is we don't really monitor the banks very closely. We don't know what they're investing in. We don't know if they're solvent or not. We leave that to other people. And it's rational, I would say, for us to do so, because if we were to spend time monitoring, it would be very costly for us to go ahead and do that monitoring. And by the way, there's very little likelihood that even if we were right, we would actually be able to get our money out ahead of other people in a run. So we're rationally ignorant. This is different from creditors of sophisticated companies. Sophisticated creditors of other types of corporation. But it does mean that when a bank fails, people like you and me, regular kind of retail depositors, we panic. We rationally panic. We freak out. We are not sure if only our bank is insolvent or if all the banks are insolvent. How do we know, right? We just go to the bank on the local street corner. We don't know the difference between those and the other banks. And so what you will often see is that in the financial sector, a failure by one financial institution can lead to runs on other financial institutions, and you can have a system-wide panic. This is very different from any other sector in the economy. So I'll give you an example. In late 2008, Circuit City, the #2 U.S. electronics retailer, went bankrupt. Now, if that had been a bank, there would have been a run on its competitors, most likely, because other creditors might, well, maybe all these electronic retailers are no good. Maybe they're all junk. But that didn't happen. So Best Buy, which is the #1 electronic retailer, is still doing fine. The creditors didn't panic, didn't run on Best Buy. Why not? Well, these were creditors who negotiated the terms of lending, monitored Best Buy, knew they were protected by certain contractual clauses, and so they reacted with rational calm. In fact, they realized that usually the failure of one competitor is good for the other competitors, right? Circuit City's loss is Best Buy's gain. That's not true in the financial sector. When there's a run by the creditors, they tend to all go down at once. It's because creditors rationally, in the financial sector, at least for a lot of firms, they're irrationally ignorant. They don't know who is bad and who isn't. So it's a collective action problem. It's very destructive for society when we have these runs. And so the government steps in, and has stepped in since 1934 to, first of all, guarantee bank deposits. So we have the FDIC created in 1934 by Congress to say that up to a certain amount of money, you all are protected. If the bank fails, you'll get paid in full. And the FDIC has been very successful in two ways. First of all, everyone has gotten paid. The FDIC has never failed to pay when there's been a failure of an insured bank or a covered bank. And in addition, bank runs in the United States are basically a thing of the past. We don't see this very destructive dynamic anymore. Now, why is that a good result? Well, the government is in a better position to monitor than are people like you and me in this particular sector. It's useful that we can feel safe and be a little bit ignorant and let the government step in. And the FDIC does regulate to try to prevent risk. It sets minimum capital requirements and other rules that try to prevent banks from taking too much risk. At taxpayer expense, essentially. The FDIC isn't perfect. No human institution is perfect. But in this particular instance, it's very hard, I think, to argue that it's doing a worse job than the private sector did before him when we didn't have government insurance of bank deposits, and therefore we had bank runs. Okay, so I also hear, defending the FDIC, that's old news. How does this bring us up to the financial sector bailouts? Well, some of those bailouts in 2008 were addressing situations that were very similar to a bank run. So I'll give you one example. I'll give you two examples. One I think is easier for me to defend, the other harder. The easier one to defend would be the bailouts or the guaranteeing of money market funds. So a money market is a lot like a savings account. It pays a slightly higher interest rate, and retail depositors who are otherwise unsophisticated put money in money markets. Well, there was a run on money markets after one of them got into trouble. The one was the Reserve Primary Fund. It got into trouble because it had invested a lot. It was a big creditor in terms of Lehman Brothers. As you all know, Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. And so one of them got into trouble, but there wasn't just a run on that one money market, which, by the way, might make sense if it's actually insolvent, right? There was a run on all the money markets. They weren't previously insured. The Treasury Department stepped in and says, we're going to insure money market deposits to a certain amount, and the run instantly on all the money markets stopped. I think this is very similar to a bank run, and I think it was the right thing to do for exactly these reasons. The government was in a better position than private investors to know whether this made sense or not, who was good and who wasn't. AIG would be the tougher one to defend. Okay, so I'm going to try to defend AIG, bailout of AIG. AIG, not a classic bank. A financial sector participant from an insurer rather than someone who takes standard demand deposits. And what does that say? 1 minute? I'm going to go over. Sorry about that. I'll let you know right now. This is fun. So I'm going to go long. Okay. I just got a nod. What are you going to do, right? So I'm not distracted. So AIG, very controversial. AIG received bailouts that have led to bonuses, congressional hearings, and so on. Most of the depositors, most of the creditors of AIG are people like you and me, or maybe like our parents, depending on your age, people who bought life insurance policies. This is their major product. These are households not terribly sophisticated. I'm not trying to slight them. They're just not watching that closely. They just buy a life insurance policy. And if suddenly their life insurer is going to fail, they're going to panic. They're going to rationally panic. They're going to cancel their policies. They're going to stop paying. And they may run on other insurance companies as well. And we may have a big meltdown that really isn't justified because only one insurance company, AIG, was potentially in trouble. And so I think it's the same type of creditor. And here I think government intervention would be justified. Why can't the private sector do it? Why can't we have private sector firms that, let's say, would issue credit ratings on banks so the FDIC doesn't have to do it? We saw how the rating agencies did during the 2008 financial crisis. Sometimes private sector firms are not good watchdogs. They don't have perfect incentives, and sometimes it's better for them to do it. Okay, I was also supposed to defend insider trading laws. I will try to do this briefly. Insider trading, also in the news since the financial crisis. You ever heard of Galleon Group? Major hedge funds, some of the largest and most important indictments in insider trading history. Roger Ratnam, the founder of Galleon Group, and some of his cronies have been indicted for insider trading. Individuals who have Professor Bloch's view of the economy think that insider trading laws are a bad idea. The government shouldn't be involved. Why? They think these laws are hard to enforce. They think they're arbitrary. Insider trading is going to happen anyway, and so who gets caught and who doesn't is somewhat arbitrary. There's no real victim, they will say, of insider trading. You don't know who you're trading with. You don't expect the person you're trading with on the stock market has less information and more information than you, so you're not really a victim. And this insider trading can be inefficient because when insiders trade inside information, the information they're trading on gets transmitted into stock prices, which in turn makes stock prices reflect the underlying value a bit higher. I'm going to argue, though, that there's a central problem with this, which is that when you allow insider trading in corporations, it encourages insiders basically to jack up the volatility of stock price. They don't only make money if the price is about to go up and they trade beforehand. They also make money if the price is going to go down and they trade beforehand, right? Up, down, they just want to make it more volatile. Volatility is bad for investors because investors are risk averse. So it distorts their incentives in how they manage the companies. Now, people who criticize insider trading laws will concede that. But they will say that corporations themselves could ban insider trading in their charters. Basically, this is like a private sector solution, right? They could ban it by contract. And since the private sector could handle it, we don't need public enforcement of this type of law. We don't need a blanket we don't need a blanket prohibition. Once again, I think empirically, though, the evidence isn't there. I'll give sometimes corporations fail to put things in their charter that we know would be efficient and good for shareholders. The example that has been demonstrated recently empirically is that there's clear evidence that corporations that have staggered boards, this is a board that it takes longer to vote out the directors, this tends to entrench management, makes it harder to take over the company if they're performing well. Corporations with staggered boards trade at a discount relative to corporations that don't have them. In other words, the shareholders are hurt by this, right? So the shareholders should demand a prohibition in the charter against staggered boards. And yet companies still have them. They go public without them. Folks like Professor Bloch can't explain why. I would suggest that there is some slippage. There is private sector, there is imperfections between principal-agent problems, there's informational imperfections, and sometimes the government has to step in to correct these market failures. And I think we have a market failure with insider trading as well, and that's why it makes sense for the governments to prohibit it. Sorry for going long.
I have a very soft voice, so you might have to crank it up a little. Can I be heard in the back? Professor Squire start off with some deprecation of himself. I don't like to brag, but when it comes to deprecation, I demand. They don't call me Walter the deprecatory block for nothing. I'm 68 years old. I practically drool. I can't get out of bed in the morning. It hurts everywhere. I swim and run, and my times now are double what they were when I was a kid. It's really amazing. Like my time for the 100-yard backstroke was about 1 minute, 1:03. Now I can't break 2 minutes. It's pathetic. And look at follicles. Who's got more? This is an indication of dementia, Alzheimer's. So if in the middle I fall asleep, you'll understand what's happening and why it's happening. Okay, with that deprecation out of the way, we get into the subject. I believe that we shouldn't have any government per se. Therefore, it shouldn't be intervening in anything. Why shouldn't we have any government at all? Well, because it's immoral and it's inefficient. Why is it immoral? Well, government is immoral because they force you to pay taxes and they won't allow you to secede. And if they don't allow you to secede, it's slavery. The only problem with slavery is you couldn't secede. Slavery was a pretty good idea. You could pick cotton, you could sing songs. It's just when you wanted to quit, they wouldn't let you. Well, if you can't quit, you're a slave. We're all slaves of the government. And I don't care that it's a majority. There's such a thing as the tyranny of the majority. Hitler came into power as a result of a democracy. So that doesn't qualify an institution as a legitimate one. And why is it so inefficient? It's inefficient because they never go bankrupt. I'm from New Orleans. We just had Katrina. And the fault for Katrina, it wasn't really Katrina's fault. It was rather the Army Corps of Engineers that can't make a levee to save itself, and FEMA that wouldn't allow help to come in that would otherwise come in. As a result, the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA killed about 1,500 people. What happened to the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA? Are they still in business? You're darn tootin' they are. They never go out of business, no matter how bad they are. At least when a private company doesn't give you the goods that you want at the price and the quality that you want, they can go broke. Thank goodness. So we shouldn't have any government at all because they're immoral and inefficient. If we have governments, though, the limited government libertarian position, pretty much Ayn Rand's position or Ron Paul's position, is that there should only be one function of government, and that's to protect people and property against invasions. And to that end, you need three institutions, armies to keep foreign bad guys off of us, not to go around the world imperializing and having military bases everywhere, just a strong defense, or think strong Coast Guard. Second, police to keep local bad guys off of us, and third, courts to determine who the good guys and who the bad guys are. What about financial markets? Well, I think financial markets are too important to have government intervention. If you have to have government intervention, let's have government intervention on unimportant things like paper clips and rubber bands. There they can't create too much havoc. But don't let them do anything with an important industry such as the financial industry, which is one of the most important industries of all industries, because every trade that we make, unless it's barter, one half of it is money. And money is the financial background. So what are the interventions that they do? Well, they have the Fed. The Fed is just a Soviet central planning bureau for the financial section. You know, they talk about the Dallas Fed is the free enterprise Fed. That's sort of like saying, well, the Moscow Central Planning Board is the Free Enterprise Central Planning Board. I mean, it's just silly. This is a Sovietization of our very important industry, the financial industry. We ought to be on the gold standard. If we were on the gold standard, we'd have a lot less volatility that Professor Squire is worried about. We wouldn't have any bank runs if we had 100% back dollar. The reason we have bank runs, and I'm glad he mentioned that movie, It's a Wonderful World. Wonderful Life, sorry. See, drooling. Alzheimer's is kicking in. If we had 100% back currency, we wouldn't have any bank runs. The reason we have bank runs is because of fractional reserve banking. And the reason we have fractional reserve banking is because the government can't uphold the law of contract. We have fiat currency. We have legal tender laws. We have the FDIC, the evil FDIC. Now, I will concede to Professor Squire that the FDIC, how shall I say it, is a good paper over problems. You don't have bank runs with the FDIC. You have bank runs because because the fractional reserve banks have 10% of the outstanding debt that they owe, whether it's checking deposits or whatever. So if all the people come in together and they all want their money, they just don't have it. So what the FDIC... See, it only happens to us old guys. What the FDIC does, credibly, it says that in the case of the bank run, they're going to create money galore. Well, welcome to Germany 1923 hyperinflation, if ever that happened. That is not a good thing. That's a very bad thing. See, the problem that I have with Professor Squire is that there is already government intervention that creates problems. And he thinks it's market failure. I think it's government failure to create the problem in the first place. And yes, I agree with him that we have to do something. His answer is to have more government intervention. My answer is to take away the first government intervention that caused the problem. Because what happens is, Mises says, is that every time the government intervenes, it creates a problem, and then you have to intervene to solve that problem, and then you have to intervene to solve the next problem, and pretty soon in that direction lies, you know what, the Soviet economy. He comes from the Pinko University of Chicago. It's no wonder that there are a bunch of commies there. Friedman is a commie. So I understand where he's coming from, but he really ought to get some free enterprise religion, the one true faith. With regard to bailouts, he says that one of the reasons we have to have bailouts for the financial industry is because we have unsophisticated creditors. And he's right, we're unsophisticated, but the point is we're unsophisticated in everything. We have such a thing called specialization and division of labor, which means we're unsophisticated in everything except the thing that we do as a profession. So if I'm a carpenter, I'm pretty sophisticated in carpentry, but I'm unsophisticated in everything else. Look, we have these those sandwiches. I'm unsophisticated about that. You're unsophisticated about that because none of you are in that business, I presume. Maybe one or two of you are. We don't know what's in those sandwiches. We're very unsophisticated. So if unsophistication is the carte blanche or the opening for government intervention, we're going to have government intervention in everything. Rather, what we do is we trust brand names. We trust not the Food and Drug Administration, those illegitimi. Can't use the B word here to keep my scholarly cool. Because when the FDA makes a mistake, they don't go broke. They approved the thalidomide, and look what thalidomide did with the morning sickness and the babies, malformed babies. They didn't go broke. If there was a private certification agency for drugs, then they would have and made that mistake, they'd be gone. We're unsophisticated about cars. Do you know what's going on into the car? I don't know. I just sort of turn it on, and I have to trust the mechanic. We're unsophisticated in medicine. My elbow hurts. I don't know what's wrong with my elbow. I have to go to a doctor. I'm not a medical person. I'm unsophisticated in that. So what he is saying really is a carte blanche for intervention in everything. In other words, if unsophistication is the criteria, it's game over. We're just going to have government intervention in everything because the government is sophisticated. They know what they're doing. Look, if you look at the volatility of the stock market in the roughly 100 years before the Fed was started in 1913, and the roughly 100 years after, or about 97 years after, it's no context. Yes, there was a little blip here and there, mainly due to the fact that there was even government intervention before in the 19th century. But after, when the Fed got in there, and the FDIC and the government really got in there with Roosevelt, it's gigantic. It's humongous. So we had the what do you call it? The Depression of the 1929, 1946. We had the stuff in the 80s. We have stuff now. It's gigantic compared to what we had before. See, we might have had Bernanke or not. He could have gone, but there was not even a question that the whole Fed should be gone, except for Ron Paul. He a blessed name, because he's thanks for the Ron Paul applause. A little more enthusiasm. What he wants to do is not only monitor the Fed, but his book is called End the Fed. And the reason he wants to end the Fed is not because he likes volatility or because he wants to mess up the economy. It's because he's a medical doctor and he prescribes medicine. Well, he's a good economist. He didn't go to the University of Chicago. So he wants to get rid of the Fed, which is a creator of volatility. I mean, what's his name? Bernanke and the guy before him, Alan Greenspan, they were keeping interest rates very, very low. When you keep interest rates very, very low, what you do, according to Austrian business cycle theory of Hayek and Mises, is you misallocate resources. We're not Keynesians. The Vendar guys are the Keynesians. You have Milton Friedman and the monetarist Keynesians, and then you have Krugman and the fiscalist Keynesians, but they're all Keynesians. They're all Keynesians now, but we Austrians are not Keynesians. What their big dispute is should we have monetary intervention or fiscal intervention? Whereas the Austrians say the marketplace works. Adam Smith was right. The invisible hand will lead us to a much better economy than government intervention. Do I have 1 minute more? How much more can I go? Because I'll just keep babbling. Okay. The relationship between Circuit City and Best Buy is more complicated than Professor Squire makes out. Yes, on the one hand, if one goes out, there are more customers for the other. On the other hand, if one of them goes out, then the demand that they have for raw materials is less, and therefore they have to pay more, perhaps, because of supply conditions and less economies of scale. So it's an empirical issue. It's not very clear. With regard to AIG, it's just an insurance company. Money market funds. See, I agree with him that there is a difference between the financial institutions, not insurance companies, but financial institutions, and I count money market funds in there and certain banks. But it's because of the fractional reserve banking. The idea here is that a bank can take in $100, keep $10 as a reserve, and then give a demand deposit to Mr. A, who first came into the bank B, for $100. And then what it does, it turns around and lends 90 of it out to someone else. And now there's $190 in circulation. They created an extra $90 out of thin air. And if both A and C, who the bank lend the second 90 to, both come in, they don't have the money. Well, they shouldn't be allowed to do that. You know, in the Olympics, they have these bicycle races. And one of the bicycle races, I forget which one, they don't just race around and around, but there's a impetus for standing still on your bike. And you just sort of sit there, and sometimes very good bicyclists, you'll see them at a red light, they're just sitting on the bike and somehow they can balance. That's what fractional reserve banking is like. But we should have a four-wheeler for bicycles if we want stability. And the four-wheeler is 100% back currency. And then what the bank would do, it would have two functions. One, it would be like a tailor of money. What a tailor does is it sometimes takes a big cloth and breaks it down in little cloths. What the bank would do is sometimes take large amounts of money and lend it out to many small borrowers, or amalgamate money, take many small lenders that give the bank the money, and then give it out in a big one fell swoop to a borrower. That would be one of their functions, as a lending intermediary. The other function would be as a money warehouse. You want to put money in the bank, you don't get interest. Rather, you pay them just as you pay a warehouse for your car or your furniture. And if we had that, the thing would be totally stable. we wouldn't need the FDIC, we wouldn't need any bailouts, we wouldn't need this move toward communism that Professor Squire is advocating. Let me just end with insider trading. Here again, what happened is that the government screwed up, and you have CEO salaries that are very, very high, and it's very difficult to get rid of this chicanery, and now it's seen as if we should have more intervention because the stock market or the market for corporate shares is not working. We have market failure. No, we don't have market failure. We have government failure, and it's a two-word answer to this one, and it's called Michael Milken. Now, who's Michael Milken? Michael Milken was a junk bond corporate kind of guy. And what he would do is he would look around at companies where there was CEO salaries were out of whack, were much too high. Well, if the CEO is hogging up all the money, then the stock, they're giving fewer dividends than they otherwise could give if the CEO weren't hogging up all the money. So the stock market price is depressed. So what he would do is go in and buy it up and kick out the bad guys and put in his own guys and get rid of this problem. Well, what happened to Michael Milken? Michael Milken was sort of the watchdog of the economy. What happened? They put him in jail. What happened in the exact case is his brother, Michael Milken's brother, was mentally handicapped, something, I don't know what, and they threatened to go after his brother, and he figured that if they went after his brother, it would be very bad for his brother. So he sort of plea bargained his way out. So here we have just another case of government intervention which screws up the market, and then people like my opponent, my learned opponent from the University of Chicago, want to have more government intervention. He talks about you can't have private credit rating agencies. Now there are three: Standard & Poor, Moody's. What's the third one? Fitch. Right. Forgot that. See, Alzheimer's. I had the first two in my notes, but I forgot the third. You know, when I used to give examples of how things could be done on the market in terms of certification, what I would do is I would give the institution of kosher foods or brand names. The reason we trust McDonald's is because if their washrooms are not clean or their food isn't good, they'll lose a lot of money. So that's why we trust them, whereas we don't trust the FDA because they can't go broke. And I also used to use Standard & Poor, Moody's, and Fitch as an example of watchdogs. And what happened to these watchdogs? They didn't do a good job. Why didn't they do a good job? Because of government intervention again. What happened was, and I think my opponent here, Richard Squire, is unaware of this, or perhaps he didn't mention it, or maybe he's getting Alzheimer's, is that these rating agencies were suborned by government. They were given a monopoly or oligopoly position, since there were three of them. They were protected from incursions of new entrants into the field, and in response, what they had to do was go along with Fannie and Freddie and HUD, who were screwing up the housing market by giving people mortgages that never should have been given to them under the criteria. You know, do you have a credit rating? Do you have can you pay 20% down or anything like that? See, the Boston Fed did this study, I think it was 92, which said that black people are getting less than... Should I shut up? You know, he's a lawless man. He went over time, so I probably shouldn't, but he said I could, and he's the law here, so I'm obeying it, unlike certain people from the University of Chicago. Okay, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, the Boston Fed. They said that black people and other racial minorities weren't getting a proportionate amount of mortgages, and the reason was they didn't have the credit ratings that other people had. So the Boston Fed said this was racist, and we have to give them, not only blacks, but all sorts of people that don't have credit ratings, give them mortgages anyway, and that's why we got this TARP business, and that's a big cause of the problem. But and these credit rating agencies were told that if you don't go along with the program, you're a racist, and we're going to take away your viability, we're going to take away your monopoly or oligopoly protection. Thanks for your attention.
So I get a chance for a rebuttal. And one thing I just want to clarify is that I didn't actually attend the institution, the University of Chicago. It's worse than you thought. I did my graduate work at Harvard. Yeah, much more commie than that. So our moderator went to Chicago, so which makes sense. He would be in the middle. Just want to clarify that. I think that we'll try to brief here. My sense is that there's a difference in perspective. I think that Professor Block has an ideological view, right? So he managed to demolish not only my arguments, but the whole justification for the government. But he argued primarily, in my view, from what I feel like is a reducto ad absurdum approach. He would take one extreme example of bad government's policy and say, therefore, we shouldn't have any government at all. And that often doesn't work. And I'm going to give you, he talked about Friedrich Hayek, although Hayek, I guess, is too far to the left. Locke, but Hayek wrote a famous book called The Road to Serfdom. And his notion, it's a wonderful book, you should read it if you haven't, but his notion was that in post-World War II Europe, the fact that so many countries were going and adopting quasi-socialist state, or at least having socialist safety nets, so we have now mixed economies in Europe, as we do in the United States, between free market capitalism and government kind of protection or government intervention. He thought that once the government gets in the economy and limits economic freedom, pretty soon, or not there long after, we're going to have limitations on political freedom and religious freedom, and pretty soon we will be at the Soviet Union. And it seemed that it was very frightening, and he used the word serfdom. That's the European version of the word that Professor Block used for us, this American audience, which is slavery, right? Equally kind of in their history scary and something you don't want to go to. But it never happened. Political freedom is generally as strong in Western Europe today, despite their more interventionist states in the economy, as we have they have as much political freedom as we do in the United States. So this notion that if you've got a little bit of government intervention, you're on the road to the gulag simply isn't based in experience. And I think that when we debate these things, we should look at the empirical evidence. We should look at the facts. So he talked about sophistication. Yes, we're all unsophisticated. We're unsophisticated. I can't tell you how often when I order in food, I am so nice to the person on the phone because I'm so terrified that if I seem a little short, if I have to say for the 16th time, no, I don't want an appetizer, just send me, I don't want the breadsticks, just send me the pizza. They're going to spit on my pizza and I won't know, right? So I'm terrified. I'm unsophisticated. I can't know any better. But when one restaurant has an E. coli breakout, we don't have food panics. All restaurants don't close. When one bank fails, we have runs on all banks. We have empirical evidence that says that the situation is different, and in this particular situation, maybe we should have some kind of government intervention. So I think that, again, we have empirical evidence that we should be using rather than what I feel like a reducto ad absurdum approach is based on a very strict kind of ideological approach. With respect to fractional reserve banking, I am a little bit confused about the argument, and I'm sure that I'm wrong about this, but it seems to me that fractional reserve banking, the notion that somebody would set themselves up, a private entity as a bank, say, I'll take your deposit and turn around and lend out some of the money, is not a phenomenon that's created by the government, nor is it a phenomenon that's created by fiat currency. Before we had fiat, meaning paper currency, basically the government controlled the value. Back when currency was gold or coin was the only type, you still had banks that would set up and then lend out the money. That's a private sector arrangement that's being created by private contract. And you had runs on banking institutions going back to the 16th century, back to the Medici Bank and so on. It is the federal government, as far as I understand, that actually limits federal fractional reserve banking by dictating that banks hold a certain minimum amount of fraction as in reserve. Otherwise, if it was just by freedom of contract, they might hold even less. So I'm sure I'm wrong. I'm going to be disputed on that. But I think it's strange to think that fiat currency or governments are creating fractional reserve bankings. I think to prevent fractional reserve banking, you would have to have the government intervene in the financial markets, override private contracts, and prevent banks from doing what they naturally would want to do. With insider trading, so we agree. I think we both think that people like Michael Milken can be heroic, not him maybe specifically, but people who are raiders, who take over companies that have bad management, kick them out, and try to put in better management. One of the examples I cited is that if we leave it to private contract, firms will often put into their charters provisions that prevent hostile takeovers, such as staggered boards and so on, and we may need government intervention because the market's not fixing this problem. But again, I think we saw a reductio ad absurdum argument here. Michael Milken, yes, he is in jail, but there are lots of takeover artists who are not in jail. And so the fact the government put one of them into jail doesn't mean that the government is shutting down this market solution. And I don't think, again, we should take kind of one example and therefore run with it all the way to a full condemnation of all government intervention in the financial markets. Never say never.
I apologize for claiming that he went to the University of Chicago. He went to Harvard, which I guess is even worse, although I'm not sure. At least the Harvardians have the decency to come out clear as socialists. What really ticks me off about the Chicago people is they claim to be free enterprise. I mean, they're riding under false colors, and you ought to be ashamed, not you. I'm now accused of being an ideologue. We're all ideologues. Ideologues just means you're interested in ideology. And ology is the study of, and ideology is the study of ideas. And we're all doing that, so I don't see why I should be singled out as an ideologue since we all do it. Yes, I like the reductio ad absurdum argument. What the reductio ad absurdum argument is, you take the logic of what they're saying, and you infer from that, and you make conclusions, and the conclusions are ridiculous, and then you go back and say, well, so must the premises of it. I defy anyone to give me one example of a good government policy. There cannot be any such thing. Look, if I come up to you with a gun, and I say, give me a money robber, blow your head off. And I'm a philosophical robber, so you're willing to dialogue. I'm an ideological robber. You're willing to dialogue with me, and you say, tut, 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 not so fast. You said you were a libertarian. What's this initiatory coercion business going on? And I said, you're right. Here, I'll give you the wrapper from my cough drop. Now, does that make it just? No. Yes, the government will do things that are seemingly good if you only look at one half of the equation, namely them giving you something. But where did they get the thing from? Where did they get the thing from in the first place? They got it with a gun. If you don't pay your taxes on April 15th, they're going to send you a very nice letter. Have you forgotten? We'll give you a month, whatever. And then they'll send you another letter in a half a year, and then eventually they'll come after you with the men in blue, with guns. This is a coercive institution. Therefore, anything they do can't be legitimized because it's based on coercion. Any more than the robber who gives you a paper clip or a rubber band because you say, well, it's unfair, you're not giving me anything back. The key is not whether the government gives anything back. The key is, how do they get it in the first place? And if they get it on the first place based on coercion, well, then that's illegitimate. Yes, there are other corporate raiders, but look, if you shoot one crow and you put the crow up on a pole, what are the other crows going to do? They're not going to come there. If you mistreat a Michael Milken, what about the other corporate raiders? They're going to say, hey, whoa, maybe I better shape up. My email, let me give you my email address because I wrote a blistering attack on this horrible Road to Serfdom book by that Pinko Hayek. And if anyone wants it, I'll send it to you. My email address is wblock@loyno.edu, Loyno. Take notes, this will be on the exam. I'll send you that. I mean, Hayek is a very, very moderate free enterpriser, hardly deserving of the name free enterpriser. He makes a reasonable point that there is this slippery slope and that the more you intervene, it leads to more intervention. It doesn't have to go all the way to the gulag. We're not there yet, although there are certain things that are very scary about privacy that are going on now and what's happening at the airports. I sometimes think that if the next terrorist has a green shirt, they'll prohibit the wearing of green shirts. Such is the rationality of government in that area. Look, I agree with Professor Squire that if you have E. coli in one restaurant, it doesn't spread to other restaurants. Whereas if you do have it in the financial market, it does spread. We agree on that. And I'm saying that therefore there is at least a superficial case for intervention in the financial market that doesn't exist elsewhere. But my claim is that the initiatory, the reason for this imbalance, this disequilibrium, this riding a bicycle and trying to stand still on the bicycle is because of prior government intervention. Yes, there were bank runs from time immemorial, but there was fractional reserve banking from time immemorial. Look, what a fractional reserve bank is bankrupt because its instantaneous debts are greater than its instantaneous assets. It's only got $100 in my example, and it's got 190 outstanding, so it ought to be allowed to go bankrupt. The government protects it. Look, there are libel laws against fomenting a bank run. If I say that the ABC Bank is wonky, I can be put in jail for that. So this is a prior government intervention. This is not, fractional reserve banking is not part of the market contract. You see, any 100% reserve bank would go through a clearinghouse and raid the fractional reserve banking and make them pay up right then and there. And they couldn't because they don't have the money, but the government will protect them. See, so what I'm trying to say is that the government takes on the monopoly of law and then it violates law. It violates property rights. So fractional reserve banking is hoary with tradition, but it's not part of the market. With regard to, inside trading, look, there are two contracts I can make. I'm going to explore for oil. And, by the way, I have nothing against private inside trader laws. In other words, if the stock market says that if you're going to go on the ABC stock market, you can't do insider trading, that's a private rule of a private club, that's fine. I'm not against that. What I'm against is government prohibiting voluntary contractors from doing something else. So here I am. I'm exploring for oil. And I have two ways to go. One, I can hire Professor Squire, who is an archaeologist, and I say, look, I'll give you $30,000 a year. Go thou, and here's my helicopter, and sniff around and try to find something. And if you get it, I'll let you buy a lot of stock. I'll let you be an insider trader. I don't mind that. On the other hand, I can say, I'll give you $150,000, which, say, an archaeologist would get. But now you have to contractually promise that you can't take advantage of anything you find. You have to tell me about it. And you can't benefit from it. Are both contracts compatible with the free enterprise system? Yeah. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with making him sort of a junior partner and saying, look, I'll give you the money, I'll give you the pickaxe or whatever you need to go find oil or gold or whatever it is. And I'm paying you very little, but I'm paying you the rest of your salary in the form of potential insider trading. And the other one is, I make the other contract where he can't do that, but I pay him a bigger salary. So it's just sometimes you get wages and money, and sometimes you get wages and working conditions or perks. So I don't see anything. I don't see why the government should forbid one of these contracts. I'm looking forward to the question and answer. Thanks for your attention.
I think we'll start the Q&A. I have to admit, I'm still reeling from having just been called a socialist. Now Chicago is hated from the left because we're blamed for ruining the world economy, and we're blamed from the right for not being conservative enough. So I guess no one likes us. So I'm sitting here with a pity party for myself. Actually, I'll take advantage by actually consulted moderator privilege and ask the first question for Professor Block. I remember in college, you have these debates. I'm sure you've all had them with those who favor the more communist view of the world. And when you point out the fact that the Soviet Union doesn't work and Cuba doesn't work and pre-capitalist China didn't work, they always have the same stock response. No. It just hasn't been done right yet. Right? When we set up the right communist state, it's going to be fantastic. So, same question to you. If this utterly sort of libertarian anarchic world is ideal, why in the 7,000 years of human civilization have we not seen it? You say governments can't go bankrupt, but they do, and B, they do compete. Right? There are some countries that are countries of immigrants, some countries that aren't, because certain countries, like ours, are viewed as having better institutions, better rules that draw people from countries with worse institutions and worse rules. So given that governments legitimately compete for citizens, compete for firms, compete for industry, compete for financial services, why don't we see some state create this libertarian utopia and have all the money fled to that? There seems to be this giant empirical gap that we've never had this state. We've never had it. maybe Chicago aren't quite so communist. We're still room for us to still be the right wing without being communist.
Shut up, Connie. Is this microphone on? No.
Just pull it closer to you. They're all on.
It's on now. First of all, I resist being called a member of the right. I'm not a right conservative nor a left liberal. I'm a libertarian, and we agree with the left on certain issues more than others, and we agree with the right conservatives on economic issues, and we disagree with both on foreign policy. The way the question is couched, I see it as two questions. One, show us one example of free markets at work. And I admit I have great difficulty. This keeps fading in and out. Is it?
Just pull it closer to you.
Closer? Is this better? Yeah, that's good. Okay. There are very, very few cases of free enterprise. According to David Friedman, there was something in ancient Ireland. According to Joe Peden, there was something in Iceland that worked for several hundred years. There is a Fraser Institute and also a Heritage survey of economic freedom of the world. And what that does is it gives an empirical correlation that the more economic freedom there is, the richer they are, ceteris paribus, other things equal. It's not, what do you call it, a clear indication. There is no perfect free enterprise system. So I can't point to examples other than these two, ancient Ireland and ancient Iceland. Why is this? Why is it that libertarians only have 2, 3, 4% of the vote? Why is it that Ron Paul, when he mentioned these things in the run-up for the Republican nomination, he was just seen as a weirdo? I'm convinced because of socio-biological considerations. What is sociobiology? Sociobiology is the theory that we are the way we are now because of what it meant to survive 1 million years ago when we were in the caves or in the trees or wherever we were. And to make a long story short, we are hardwired for explicit cooperation. Explicit cooperation is if Professor Squire is sick today, I'll help him, he'll help me tomorrow. Societies or ethnicities or groups or species that had that were more likely to survive than ones that didn't. So there was a survival instinct or a survival payoff. And that's why we're hardwired, because our grandparents had this. So when we see some baby at the side of the street crying, our first instinct is to go over and give him a hug and help him and be nice. But we're not hardwired for implicit cooperation. What's implicit cooperation? Implicit cooperation is the free enterprise system, markets. Let me give you an example. When I was in New Orleans in the aftermath of Katrina, there was this guy who brought in a truckload of water. And ordinarily, you go get a gallon of water in a supermarket, it's 50 cents, 25 cents, $1, something like that. He was selling it for $20 a gallon. And there was a long lineup of people. And they were going to buy the water at $20 a gallon. Why? Because they valued the water at more than $20. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been online to buy it. One of them had a cell phone and called the cops. And he said, there's a price gouger out there. He's right online waiting to get it. And yet he called the cops, and the cops came and shut it down, and everyone online applauded him. Now, can you imagine that? I mean, they say there are no contradictions in nature, but that's as close as you're going to get. Here are the people that were trying to benefit from the price gouging, and they were against price gouging. Namely, biologically, they're not hardwired for that. Now, let me give you just one more example of sociobiology. How many people here are afraid of snakes? A lot of people are afraid of snakes. How many people are afraid of bathtubs? Nobody's afraid of a bathtub. Yet bathtubs kill more people nowadays than snakes.
I love bathtubs.
When Indiana Jones had his movie, he didn't have bathtubs surrounding the treasure. He had snakes. Milton Friedman was killed by a bathtub. He was 92 or very old, and he slipped up in the bathtub, and he hit his head, and on the way to the hospital, he had a heart attack and died. Bathtubs are dangerous, but we're not hardwired to fear them. Little kids fear snakes. They don't fear bathtubs. We all are of us. The reason libertarianism is such a hard sell is because we're not hardwired to accept it. We're not hardwired to accept implicit cooperation. But the only way we can cooperate with 6 billion people is implicitly through markets. Leonard Read has this wonderful thing about a pencil that no one person can even make such a humble thing as a pencil.
We need cooperation, and the only way we can coordinate with each other, and Hayek here is very good, is through prices. But we're not hardwired to accept prices. When prices rose in the aftermath of Katrina, there are two salutary effects of price rises. One is the fact that if the price rises, the first guy in line isn't going to hog up all the orange juice. He's going to leave some for other people, or hog up all the gas, or whatever it is. And the second one is it calls forth supplies from elsewhere. That's why this guy from Kentucky came down with a truck. See, if we don't have implicit cooperation through prices, all we have is benevolence. Namely, the reason people would come to New Orleans is just to help us out. But we want to marshal all the human motivations if there's a dire problem, and one of the motivations is self-interest that Adam Smith said. He said it's not for benevolence that the butcher and the baker and candlestick maker give us their wares, it's out of a keen appreciation of self-interest. But we are not hardwired to accept it. We think it's price gouging, and we're against it. Governor Blanco said she would throw people in jail for doing it, and everyone is applauding her. That's why we're not doing as well as we could, because the human race is not conducive to this sort of a thing.
My question is for Professor Squire, and I was just wondering if you could respond to the argument that the cause of all these problems in the financial markets and the economy in general are, in fact, a market failure, specifically some things such as the Federal Reserve setting rates, in effect giving free money to the big banks on the one hand. On the other hand, with prior quasi-bailouts like long-term capital management setting the too big to fail policy, at least implicitly, and in the housing market with Fannie and Freddie creating market perversions. So you had a combination fiscal, monetary, and other interventions in the market that created this problem.
Richard, I would suggest you repeat the question because a lot of people might not have heard it. Just summarize it.
Okay, so the question, great question about whether I can say anything about the fact that many of the, I think if I may summarize, the predicates to the 2008 financial crisis were bad government policies, government interventions, too much money, the encouragement of a mortgage market, and therefore too much debt. And is there some kind of irony maybe in that I'm defending, or there's some kind of, that I'm defending government intervention to clean this up when it's the government that caused the problem in the first place. And I think that there is no doubt that to say that markets sometimes fail is not to say that the government's perfect. The government fails. I actually think we have more government intervention than we should in the markets. Most of those policies, I'm not sure about the Federal Reserve in this instance. Certainly the mortgage policies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, I think they're disasters and so on. But I don't think that, I think there's maybe reductio ad absurdum is the wrong term. I think there's an extrapolation problem. I think that just because we have too much government intervention and therefore we would be better off with less, doesn't mean that we would be best off with none. And I think that there are instances in which the government is useful. And I think that they're for the exact same reason that have been cited by Professor Block. I think there are socio-biological reasons why markets sometimes fail, why individuals may not be fully rational, or if they are rational, it's because of concerns that they're going to be expropriated by others. So I think that we have to look empirically at what government programs work, what government programs don't work, and approach it from that basis. And I think you've listed some government programs that don't work. I shouldn't have said ideological either. I'm sorry about that. We're all ideological. I think that it's more an issue of first principles. It seems that I think that Professor Block largely argues from first principles. He says the government is like somebody holding a gun to your head and taking money, and therefore everything in the wake of that is illegitimate. That's a very powerful argument from a first principle, like the whole tree is tainted because the root is tainted. And I think that that's the way a philosopher argues very effectively. I would like to say, I don't want to approach it that way. I want to say sometimes the government saying if you don't do this, you go to jail is good. We get good results from that, and often it's bad, and try to analyze it that way.
I would say that there are certain legitimate laws that the government does uphold, and I applaud them for it, even though I think it would be better if private sources did this, namely laws against murder, rape, theft, fraud, things like that. Every time they put a murderer away or a rapist away, I applaud them. But it's sort of like two gangs. There's the Blood and the Crips. The government is a bigger gang, the other is a smaller gang. Every time the Blood puts a Crips guy out of commission, I applaud, and vice versa. With regard to market failure, technically there are only 4 or 5 or 6, well, they keep inventing new ones, but the main market failures are monopoly externalities and public goods. I think that that's just nonsense on stilts, but I don't have time to say why. But I don't deny that people make mistakes. That's why we have bankruptcy. And bankruptcy is great, and we don't... And what he said was that when you have bankruptcy, you want to have an orderly movement. I don't want to have any orderly anything. Orderly means governmental. I think bankrupts, they shouldn't be protected by Chapter 11 or anything. They're bankrupt, they should go to the wall and that's it, and they shouldn't be protected. I mean, Chrysler was about to go bankrupt and they bailed them out with various subsidies or promises. You see, the thing is that when people in the market make a mistake, and they do make mistakes, that's why they put erases at the back of pencils, we have this automatic feedback mechanism. Namely, you go bankrupt. But when government makes a mistake, you don't have it, or you have it in a greatly attenuated way. You have to wait 4 years for the next election. You have a package deal. You might have liked Bush on policies 1, 3, 5, and 7, and Obama on, not Bush, McCain on policies 1, 3, 5, and 7, and Obama on policies 2, 4, 6, and 8. You had no way of focusing on anything. You just had to pick one column A or column B. Whereas in the market, you can pick a purple shirt or a striped tie or whatever. There's no package deal. When I bought this tie, it didn't say, well, you have to buy shoes too. Right? So the market is a much more delicate scalpel, whereas the government at best is a big bludgeon that just runs awry.
So on that very note, just looking for consistency, the only thing that I heard you, Professor Bloch, say that I would ask you to elaborate, when you said with a fractional reserve, one guy gives him $100 and he lends out more than $100, you said they shouldn't be allowed to do that. So my question is, who would disallow it and how would they disallow it, please?
It would be disallowed on the grounds of fraud, and if they were private defense agencies, they would put these people in jail, and if they weren't, what the government should do is put them in jail for having the audacity to commit fraud. There is a whole literature on that, and we could have spent a whole hour on that. So if you want, email me, wblock@loyno.edu, or just Google me. You'll find my email address, and I will send you more stuff on this than you'll want to read.
I think we have time for one more question because we're going to get changed out for a classroom. So think of it. And longest. Yeah.
I have a question for Squire. I have a lot of problems with what you said, but the biggest problem is that when you said...
Please sit down, you're staring at me. No,
you said I'm not quite there yet with regard to losing our freedom. Yet you cited an example when Michael Milken goes to jail with victimless crime, and then Martin Stewart goes to jail for victimless crime. So for you, apparently freedom means that I can publish on the internet that President A is an asshole, that's fine. Okay? But when somebody goes to jail for arbitrary enforcement for victimless crime, for some reason it goes well with you. And I have an issue with that because that's where freedom ends, when somebody goes to jail arbitrarily for victimless crime.
Who was the second guy you mentioned besides Malcolm?
Martin Stewart and Michael Milken. So the fact that I can yuck about whatever, the dog keeps barking, the caravan keeps moving. That's what it is. It doesn't change anything, but when the government can force anybody to jail to force some type of behavior, it's a glaring example of losing freedom.
So Martha Stewart went to jail for lying to a federal official during the context in which she had said she would tell the truth.
Is this a crime?
So fraud would be one example. So my opponent himself would say that he likes laws against fraud. I would imagine he would also want a justice system in which witnesses would be required in open court to tell the truth, and if they didn't, they would be prosecuted for perjury. So I think that we could argue about whether in that context Martha Stewart should be prosecuted, but she was lying and obstructing justice, and I think obstructing justice is not a victimless crime. Because it makes it very difficult for the government to prosecute violent crimes and other types of crimes. Now, for Milken, I didn't say that insider trading is victimless. I think it has a broader cost in terms of the efficiency of the financial markets. I think it has efficiency costs that makes it hard ultimately for firms to raise capital. I'm saying that the victim is not, when somebody engages in insider trading, the victim is not the counterparty to the trade. It is a more kind of diffused kind of cost, but there nevertheless is a cost. By the way, if you think that fractional reserve banking is a fraud on you, that would suggest that you didn't know about it, you were lied to, and you still are doing it. So now you all know the banks are engaging in fractional reserve banking. If you don't run out right now and take all of your money out because you know this, I would say that it's no longer plausibly fraud.
All right, and we'll end there. So thank you, Walter. Thank you.